Well, welcome back to Development Day, dealing with the tough stuff. The Institute of Managers and Leaders is bringing to you today. As I said in the first session, the registrations are around 3,500 for today's Development Day across the 4 webinars, and we're so excited to deliver it for our members. It's as I said at the outset, it's complimentary for our members, these Development Days. So it's a really valued piece for members, and it's also central to what the Institute does, which is create better managers and better leaders for a better society. We passionately believe that management and leadership skills can be taught, can be learned through these sorts of sessions. We also offer opportunities to network, opportunities to be a mentor or be a mentee through our mentoring program, and ongoing continuous learning opportunities like today, but also our masterclasses, our development programs, and also a range of other webinars, online and face-to-face learning experiences that the Institute tries to bring. We've been doing it for 80 years, and we don't tick boxes when it comes to training. We focus on practical outcomes, and there's no better person to deliver practical outcomes than Marnie Cook. And Marnie's backed by popular demand. She was in our last Development Day. The feedback was phenomenal, from all participants. And as I said, backed by popular demand, Marnie, for today's session, which is on personality and conflict. And I'm, for one, really looking forward to this session. And I know it's going to be really interesting because often DISC, the DISC tool is the thing that resonates in our development programs. Across all of the development programs, we use DISC, in our foundations and accelerate programs specifically, we use DISC, but we also use it in masterclasses. And I know Marnie's going to lean a lot on DISC in this presentation. So it's going to be fantastic. This second session, it'll run till 11:30, and then my colleague Paminda Sandhu will run the afternoon session, which is going to be fantastic. And as I said earlier, Paminda's going to bring some new ways of doing it. I'm sure she's going to host these much better than I am, but we're really looking forward to Paminda hosting this afternoon session. So dealing with the tough stuff, personality and conflict. Okay, so why does it feel like some people drive us crazy? Many factors influence our response to conflict. Our personality and therefore our preferred communication style is one of the biggest factors. Some personalities tend to avoid conflict, some like to smooth everything over, and some become aggressive. Our personality even impacts how we perceive conflict itself. So using DISC and conflict resolution models, this session aims to help you uncover how your personality type responds to conflict, why you respond to conflict in a particular way, how each personality type tends to behave in a conflict situation, how to communicate assertively and effectively when under pressure, and how to achieve a win-win outcome during a conflict. And I know Marnie is passionate about really focusing on practical outcomes. And as I said, that's what our learning and development aims to do. All of you should have your action plans in front of you. If you don't have those, you can download it from the website. To stop, start, and continue. So behaviours you'll stop, start, and continue from today's session that you can take away with you and use to reflect on after the session. In terms of questions, please send questions throughout the presentation. I will monitor those, and Marnie will come to a Q&A session after her presentation, but please send them throughout the session, enabling me to sort of prepare those questions for Marnie at the end. And also, we've had a number of questions or comments through our resources being sent. Yes, all the resources and all the recordings from each of today's sessions will be sent to you at the conclusion of the day. So you'll have all those for safekeeping to reflect and learn back on. So that will be sent at the conclusion by the team. Now, Marnie has worked with businesses, large and small, across sectors including auto, pharmacy, health, fashion, convenience, department stores, professional services, and travel. I think that's about every industry out there, Marnie. Marnie was a program director at the Australian Centre for Retail Studies at Monash University, designing and delivering executive education for retail and wholesale businesses. More recently, Marnie enjoyed a 5-year tenure as industry professor at the University of Adelaide Business School and program director of the wine business. Since 2006, Marnie has worked as a consultant, advisor, educator, mentor, and facilitator, as she does with IML. Marnie is passionate about developing the business acumen of industry professionals. A strong advocate of industry needs being met through education, and Marnie has worked with a diverse client base, including Coopers, Yalumba, Caltex, Department of Defence, Myer, Red Cross, Repco, and Toyota. I can't think of anyone better that can deliver our topic today on personality and conflict than Marnie Cook. Marnie, welcome.
Thank you. I hope everyone can hear me okay. That coming through all right, Sam?
That's perfect, Marnie. Loud and clear.
Thank you. That's a lovely introduction. I have to say, I perhaps wish I wasn't quite the expert on conflict. That might not be a great reflection on me. However, I like to think that we can look at different ways of thinking about conflict, and certainly the ways that personality impact it. And I think one of these things about conflict is that a lot of us are quite scared of it. You've probably heard a little bit about that this morning, but once we understand more about the role that personality plays in it, we can do a whole lot more with it to make sure that we're resolving conflicts effectively, and we're working more towards a win-win outcome instead of a more transactional approach, which is I win, you lose, or perhaps even I get half of what I want and you get half of what you want. So what I'm going to do today, and thank you for stepping through the agenda for the next sort of 40 minutes, understanding that role that conflict plays, but also how that relates to the conflict model, which some of you may have seen. But I doubt that many of you have thought about how those two models interrelate. So I think that many of you will find that quite interesting today. I really want it to be very, well, as interactive as a webinar can be, in that I'm going to ask you guys that are watching now to actually place yourselves somewhere on the DISC map. And so we're going to go through that shortly. Firstly, to understand the role that personality plays, I mean, it can't be understated, especially in the workplace. Every single time I work with a client, I hear, oh, communication's not great, and we don't resolve conflicts, and the same thing comes up again and again. But rarely do we say, hey, look, we're trying to understand personalities and therefore how to best drive performance. I think that idea of personality is underestimated, and sometimes we push it under the carpet a little bit because we expect one another to be super professional and perhaps leave our personalities at the door. But we're humans first and we're workers second. So the more that we understand what makes people tick, the better off we are to work effectively with others. So the hereditary predispositions and early life experiences, would you believe, form, and it depends on which report you see, because of course academics continue to research this stuff. But most of the reports that I've seen say it's anywhere between 75 and 80% of our personality is determined within the first 5 to 7 years of life. Some of it being genetic, as in, we're born with it, and then certainly the early life experiences tend to shape us, which I think at the time of learning and reading about this, I think I had an 8-year-old and I started thinking, oh dear, my opportunity to perhaps influence this personality might be done and dusted. However, we do then have subsequent experiences, life experiences, work experiences and so on that do shape our personality, but to a much lesser degree, and is certainly in as far as our personality and our default personality. But what happens is, as we get older and we have more experience, we learn, and this is the bit that Sam was saying before, we can actually learn how to adapt, and we can actually learn how to communicate and lead differently based on situational requirements. And there's the other factors that we need to think about. We've got to want to do things a little bit differently. We've got to have a real willingness to understand others and to understand ourselves. And then we also need to learn some skills. So we're going to focus on a couple of those things today. The DISC profiling tool that Sam referred to, some of you may have come across before, either with IML or perhaps in other contexts. It's one of my favourite, and I'll tell you why. It's easy to relate to communication, it's easy to relate to conflict, and it's easy to relate to leadership. So it's one of those tools that can actually be used. So you're not spending all of your time trying to understand the tool. It's quite easy to understand. And then you can put your efforts into the so what can I do about that now that I understand this? So I think it's a fabulous one for us to use in this context. And I just want to talk to you about how DISC is constructed. So those of you that have seen the IML version of DISC, it might look a little bit different. It looks more like a circle. And in order to get that output or that document that some of you may have seen, requires, you have to go on and put a fair bit of data in and answer some questions and so on. So what I've done here is I've really simplified it right down for the purpose of you guys being able to see, okay, well, what am I? And so some of you may have done it already. And if you haven't, this might be new to you, but whether you've done it or not, I want you to think about placing yourselves somewhere on this matrix that you can see. And what it's going to do is to help you understand what your default communication style might be when under pressure. And also to think about, is that the same as when I've done DISC before or I've done similar before? So I'm going to step you through that, and I'm going to start by asking you a few questions. So what DISC is really looking at, and you can see, and I've got my little cursor here, hopefully that's coming through, but you can see we've got a couple of continuum here. This one that I'm going, that's going up and down on the page, is the degree to which you like a fast-paced, big picture, and so on, versus, hang on a minute, slow things down, let's look at the detail and so on. And a good way to think about this is you can ask yourself a few questions to determine where on this line you are. Now, some people are quite extreme, either end, and some people are not so extreme, so they might be sort of, one side of the line or the other, but we tend to be more comfortable in one half of the page, if you like. So what I'm going to get you thinking about, which half of the page are you on? Are you the top half or are you at the bottom half? Now, fast paced, think to yourself, if you're chatting with friends and so on and they're telling a story, are you thinking, come on, hurry up, jump to the punchline, let's get on with it? Or are you more likely to be asking questions going, oh, hang on a minute, what did they say then? And then what happened? If you're more the let's jump to the punchline, you're probably up on this top half of the page. If you're more asking questions and asking for clarity and thinking sort of, hang on a minute, the devil's in the detail, what were the actual words that were said? You're probably more on the bottom half of the page. And think about to yourself, when you make decisions, do you sort of make a snap decision and then sort of move on with it? Or do you like to consider all of the options and get concerned about rushing a decision? So when I say fast and slow, it's certainly not about the pace at which you work. So it doesn't mean you're quicker at doing a job or slower at doing a job, but which is the way that you prefer to work? And if you're finding it hard to answer that question, what would your close mates say? I bet you anything they'd be able to pop you either in the top half or the bottom half of the page. So hopefully you've got that in your minds now. You've placed yourself either at the top half or the bottom half of the page. Then the other continuum that DISC is sort of looking at is the degree to which you prefer information that come in the way of facts, or if you go more on gut and emotion. And sometimes that's correlated with more of a task orientation versus a people orientation. So again, in order to determine, am I on the left-hand side of the page or am I on the right-hand side of the page, what we would think about, we'd ask ourselves, well, hang on a minute, if I am trying to make a really important decision, am I likely to read lots of reports, look on all the websites? If I'm buying a phone, am I going to be looking at all the criteria and all of the technical components? And that would put me more on the left side of the page. But if I'm on the right side of the page, I probably ask everybody else what they think. Now, we tend to use both. One's more left side of the brain and one's more right. And with just about every single thing that we do, we use both sides. But we tend to place more importance on one or the other. So, for instance, when I'm making a decision, I'm asking everybody else what they think. I might still then go back to fact check and to look at websites, and then but I probably go this way first. So sometimes I might make a decision on gut and then I go back and I back it up, fact checking. Someone who's on the left side of the page is more likely to go, hang on a minute, difficult problem to solve. I need to go into the back cave and I actually just need to look at the data and I'm going to take the emotion out of it. So think to yourself, are you more on the left side of the page? Are you more on the right side of the page? So what that will do now is once you determine top, bottom, left, right, you're now sitting in a quadrant. So for instance, If you like fast, quick, get to the punchline, come on, let's get on with it, and you're fact and figure oriented, so perhaps you prefer, you know, the maths orientation, maybe rather than being a painter. So oftentimes this side of the page does lean more on the creative professions sometimes, and the left-hand side perhaps more on science. Again, it's to do with the left and the right side of the brain. You might be only slightly more one than the other, but if you are more slightly more facts, figures, data, let's get it done, let's not make it personal, let's just get on with it, i.e. just do it, you're sitting up here in the top left quadrant. If on the other hand, you come on, let's get on with it, but you go by gut and by people and by intuition, and with relationships and so on, so you might make a quick decision based on somebody that you trust, you're probably up here in the top right quadrant. If you're on the bottom half of the page and you're actually more task oriented, fact driven, you're perhaps preferring the detail, you probably find yourself quite an analytical person. You'll go, hang on a minute, let's slow it down, let's make sure we do it the right way and therefore get the right outcome. And it's not that you're slower at doing things, but it is that you would want to do things the right way, make sure the correct process is followed, take emotion out of it, and so on. And so that would put you in this bottom left-hand quadrant. If you are on the bottom half of the page, but you're more the people orientation, you might be going, hang on a minute, let's just slow this down and get consultation. Let's actually see what everybody else thinks. And that way, if we follow that process, what we do is make sure that everybody's happy and we'll make sure that we've done it right and get the right outcome. So it's just slightly different ways at looking at problem solving and communicating. So if you're bottom half of the page are more people oriented, you'd be down here in this bottom right quadrant. So what does that mean? Well, according to DISC, what it means is if you're in the top quadrant here, it'd be interesting to know of those of you, I think there's 368 of you watching this right now, how many of you are sitting up in this top left quadrant, which is known as dominant. I'm going to talk you through some of the characteristics that tend to define preferred communication styles of a dominant person, and also what tends to happen when they're feeling under pressure. If you're in the top right corner, you'd be known as, under the DISC model, influencing, bottom right, steady, and the bottom left, compliant. Don't worry too much about those words, because you might have plopped yourself in the bottom left corner here and you think, compliant? I'm not compliant. Don't worry so much about the word. Think about more what that quadrant is saying about the way you tend to work, and importantly, how you default in a conflict situation. So I'm going to step you through some of those characteristics. So hopefully you've placed yourself on one of those quadrants. And now what I want you to think about is, hang on a minute, what does that mean about me? And see if you think that this tends to describe you. So if you're in the top left quadrant, a dominant and direct communicator tends to prefer to take control. Let's just get it done. Prefers a task orientation, tends to be quite fast paced, doesn't want the to be taken advantage of. So they actually want to go, hang on, let's just take the emotion out of it or the personality out of it, and let's actually just get it done. And they can be perceived by others as impatient. Now, sometimes, and you'll see the words that I've used here might sound a little bit negative. Every personality, every trait that we have is a double-edged sword. So when I say direct, some people really like a direct communication style. The other side of that coin can be direct can come across as abrupt. So it's an example of how all of these traits that we have in our personality are neither good nor bad. They can be good or bad, depending on the context and the situation, but they are a double-edged sword. Our personality traits are a double-edged sword. In some circumstances, they become our strength, and in others, not so much. So what we want to do is understand more about the other personality styles so that we can work more effectively with them. Have a look at influencing. So influencers tend to have alliances. They build relationships. That's the most important thing to them. They want to be accepted by others. They tend to be fast-paced still, but they don't want to be rejected and they don't want others to dislike them. And they can come across, the double-edged sword, as disorganized. They can come across as flighty, jumping from one thing to the next. The right side of the page is characterized by that need for acceptance and that need to form relationships. And so the steady and social on the bottom right quadrant personality type is still going to be heavily motivated by that need to have relationships and to be accepted. However, the difference between perhaps the more influencing style and the steady or social style is more to do with pace. So influencing will jump from one thing to another, probably really good at starting things, not so good at finishing things. And whereas steady will be more comfortable if there's a defined, clear, fair process. So they don't necessarily, it's not that they don't like change, but they want to make sure that change can happen in the right way. So they prefer things to be a bit more predictable, like to know what's coming. Whereas if you're in this top right quadrant, you'll probably answer questions off the cuff. You might actually, be happy to be able to, make a decision on the spot. Whereas that would probably put a steady or social person in a bit of a spin. Equally, the compliant and cautious personality type does not look like being put on the spot or being under pressure in that sense, because they want to do things right. So the slight difference between a compliant personality and a steady personality is still, let's slow it down, let's do it right, let's follow the process. However, less reliance on whether someone likes me or not. So they will deliberately try to take out those personality factors, and they will want to make sure that it's data oriented. So oftentimes when I'm working with clients, if they, and naval engineers are a great example, and sorry if there are any of you watching, but oftentimes those personality styles do choose professions that end up being quite mathematically oriented, where there is a formula and where there is a correct answer, because the compliant and cautious type doesn't like getting things wrong. Now, the double-edged sword with compliance and cautious personality types is that they want to get it right. They will be very, very thorough. The flip side of that is that sometimes other personality types can see that as slow or too detail-oriented, and sometimes critical. A compliant person really wants to point out where improvements can be made or where there's an error that's been made, and they'll do that thinking that they're being helpful. And other personality types, and you can imagine the diagonally opposite here, might feel like they've had cold water poured all over their fire. So different personality types are looking through a slightly different lens. So that compliant personality could be, perceived as being critical, and when that may not be the intention. So looking back at dominant, the difference between these two, if you're sort of thinking, I'm not sure which one I am, dominant would make a decision, a snap decision. Compliant would slow the process down. So hopefully that helps you to determine where you'd be sitting on that map. What I would like to point out, I know some of you have done the analysis that looks at what type of bird you are. For those of you that have, or for those of you that might do it in the future, dominant's the eagle. So, and I think that conjures some imagery in your minds. The influencing is more of the peacock, who doesn't mind being the centre of attention. The steady and social is more the dove, so they're looking for peace and making sure everybody's happy. And the owl is the wise old owl, making sure that that things are followed and done correctly. So that's another good way of thinking of C. There is correct. A C personality does like to be correct. Now I want to show you how this relates to the conflict model. Some of you have seen it before. Now I'm just going to scan back to this previous model. Now think about these still as being quadrants. And what tends to happen is we are very variable beasts. So whilst my default might be dominant, sometimes I'm more influencing, sometimes I'm steady, sometimes I'm compliant. We're all a bit of everything. It's the degree to which we are, put together that tends to determine our dominant style, if you like. Now, when we're thinking about that, what tends to happen is when we're under pressure, our default preferred communication style comes out. So if your main style is influencing, when under pressure, you probably default to that quadrant. If you're under pressure, And so think about this in a conflict situation. That's when we are under pressure. We tend to default to our preferred or dominant style. So I'm going back to this conflict model. So some of you have seen this conflict model, and this is actually built on slightly different variables. So up and down the page here is the importance when we're in a conflict situation, the degree of importance that I place on my own needs being met, high or low. And then the other variable here is the degree to which I place on the other party's needs being met, high or low. So I've just called this here my needs and your needs. So think about a conflict situation. How important is it that both of our needs are met? If it's both high, we're in this quadrant. If it's more important that my needs are met than yours, so that would be when I'm more adopting more a competitive style in a conflict situation. If I'm placing higher importance upon your needs than my own, I'd be in this smooth quadrant. And if I'm placing low importance on mine and your needs, probably I'm going to avoid that conflict. So I don't see the need to resolve it for either one of us. Now, that can be determined, first of all, by the circumstances we find ourselves in. For instance, if I'm buying a car, perhaps I don't care too much about the other party's needs. I might be more interested in getting the price that I want and the terms that I want and that sort of thing. So I might find myself in that situation in more of a compete mode. On the other hand, if I'm working with a team, I might take a short-term loss to get a longer-term gain, in which case I might find myself more in the smooth. And we do find ourselves in that quadrant more with customer service and so on. What's in the middle here is actually what you might think about with conflict, and sitting here in the middle is when we might compromise. Compromise can be a good outcome in some circumstances, but always remember that compromise means that I'm losing a bit and you're losing a bit. So I'm neither having my needs and your needs or your needs entirely met. So that's the difference between a collaborative approach, which is in this quadrant, versus a compromise. Collaborate is growing the pie and looking at ways for win-win. Compromise is more dividing up the pie equally. Compete is more, I get a bigger piece of the pie than you do. Smooth is you get the bigger piece of the pie, and so on. So again, you can see how if I'm a dominant personality, I'm probably more likely in a default situation, in a default conflict scenario, that where I'm going to default to is in this competitive mode. That's where I find it easiest because my personality dictates that. If I'm more of the steady type personality, the S in the disc, I'm probably more likely to default to this. So I may, in a conflict situation, not look after my own needs. I might let everybody else have the win and fall on the sword too often. If I'm a C, I actually might, in a default situation, prefer to go to ground. Oh, this is all too hard. I don't like conflict. I don't want to deal with it. And I might, when under pressure, the gut knee-jerk response could be to avoid it. And the I tends to, due to their personality, be more in this collaborate quadrant. So what can we do about this? What we need to think about is being more in that collaborate quadrant, because that's what win-win actually looks like. So the way that we do that is by understanding the needs of the other personalities and actually helping to give them more of what they want. And it's funny because when we are growing up and we're talking about, communication and so on, and we're talking about relationships, I remember the golden rule being shared with me by my parents, which was do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And I used to think, what the hell does that mean? And what it was saying was treat others as you want to be treated. And now I know that to be all wrong, because if I'm treating others as I want to be treated and I'm dominant, then I want everybody else to be like me. But it's much better and we get a much better outcome if we understand the other's needs and give them more of what they need, and then we can move up and to the right into that quadrant. And we can do this by understanding what the needs are of the different personality types when in a pressure situation, i.e. conflict. So some top tips that I want to share with you, let's just say you're a dominant person. You prefer people in a conflict situation to keep to the point, to talk about facts, not feelings. If they're starting to talk about feelings and so on, you're probably likely to be quite dismissive and think that that's irrelevant. If you're dominant and direct, you want to know what the options are and likelihood of success, because you want to actually make that decision quite quickly and resolve it quite quickly. And you're going to place a much higher emphasis on achievement and results than, oh, well, this is a good way to do it because then, you know, Mary and Joe and Tom will be happy and more engaged. A dominant person is probably going to be a little bit dismissive of that and say, well, actually, what's going to be the result? Equally, if you're in a conflict situation with a person who's quite dominant and direct, you can actually help to influence that outcome much quicker if you follow those steps, if you give them more of what they need. So you might be a steady social person, you have quite different needs, but if you do more of this, you're much more likely to resolve the conflict quicker. If you're an influencing, inspirational type person, you want people to support your ideas and dreams. There's nothing worse if you're that sort of personality type than someone coming across and saying, well, that's not going to work because we did this before, or that breaks the protocols, or that's not going to be compliant with the rules. The influencer feels as though they've had, you know, a bucket of water tipped over their ideas. And so that can be really demotivating for them. They also don't love being rushed. Influencers and inspirational people tend to go off on tangents all over the place. And so it might take them a while to come back and land the plane. They might be storytellers. However, because of that fast pace, they don't like repetition. They will go off on tangents, but they don't like a lot of repetition. So they do still want the specifics to be nailed down, even though they might be big picture specifics rather than detail specifics. The minute with either dominant or influencing person, you start getting bogged down in the detail, they'll switch right off. If a negotiation, discussion, problem to be solved is boring, an influence will turn right off too. So they're quite visual and do like illustrations and examples. Moving down to the bottom half of the page here, what you can do with a compliant type of personality is you can actually provide a lot of detail, remembering that they don't like being put on the spot. So if you have a situation, a problem to be solved, a conflict scenario, and if you're a compliant, cautious person, you don't want to make a snap decision. You want all of the information at hand before you resolve anything, or before you're even prepared to think about resolving a conflict, and never want to do it on the spot. So think about it in a meeting situation or something like that. Information that can be prepared and provided ahead of time can really help the C-type personality feel much more confident in decision making and resolving conflicts. So if you are working with a compliant or a cautious type personality, it's really important to be prepared and thorough and so on, or else that cautious person is going to really probably try to avoid resolving that conflict because they won't feel empowered that they have enough information. Again, that information shouldn't be gut-based, it should be facts, data, and so on. And they'll see a gimmick a mile away. So using those sorts of approaches with a more compliant and cautious person is really important. And of course, steady and social, again, on the bottom half of the page, similar attributes here to influencing, as I said before, but if they feel like, again, they are going to be rushed as opposed to an influencer, if they feel like they're going to be rushed, or that the risks aren't being identified, especially the risks as they apply to people, then they're going to feel very uncomfortable in resolving a conflict. They'll feel as though they're being pushed into a decision that wouldn't be suitable for them. So doing more of the human side, making sure it's very sincere, making sure that the human element is acknowledged, is very important for a steady and social person to feel as though they are really making a good decision in resolving a conflict and working towards a win-win. So whichever personality type you are, think about your conflict situations. You're probably thinking in your minds about some people that you work with, and you might be thinking, oh, yeah, I reckon they're in the compliant quadrant, or I reckon they're in the influencing quadrant. So now I can perhaps see why we don't see eye to eye, or we don't work particularly well together. Because what happens is we're our own measuring stick. So normal for us, it depends on what we like. So we tend to connect quite well with people who are more like us. So once we understand what other personalities are like and the lens through which they're looking and the communication preferences and how they tend to default when under pressure or in a conflict situation, it makes us understand much more that actually they're not a difficult person, they're just different to me. And that's a really critical learning and lesson from our session today. I want you to pay particular attention to when you're working with others who might be diametrically opposed to you on this model. And that's where you can tend to find conflicts most often happen. You can imagine a dominant, direct person trying to resolve a conflict with a steady social person. That can be quite difficult unless they understand the strengths and the preferred communication styles of each other and start to use each other's language. Think about this. I can keep on stomping in this area and doing all of this sort of stuff when I'm in a conflict situation, which is totally irrelevant and in fact put to the dominant person and actually puts them further away from resolving that conflict. They're more likely to dig in their heels. So think about using the other party's language. And I compare that to, you can be an English speaker, you can go to Europe. I wish we could go to Europe now, obviously we can't, but if you go to Europe and you try to use English in some countries to get what you want, you actually don't get very far. You actually need to use their language. And I think it's the same when you're dealing with a conflict situation. Try to understand more of their language, their motivators, and you're much more likely to get up into the, I'm going back to this, into this collaborate quadrant. So using more of the other party's language will automatically help you get up and to the right. So the other thing that you can do when thinking about resolving conflict and when you're thinking about other personality types, you might be in a situation where you actually don't know where on that quadrant that person is. It's often easy to plonk people in a quadrant based on our preconceived ideas of them, if we've worked with them for a long time or they're a family member and that sort of thing. But can I just give you a word of caution? That can be a little bit dangerous, because what we say in management and leadership is don't make grandiose assumptions, don't put people in a box, and here I am telling you to put people in a box. There's a lot of research that says that we actually, once we hold a belief to be true, we then look for all of the evidence to prove ourselves right. So if we believe someone to be compliant, or we believe someone to be an I in the DISC model, we might actually then look for all of the evidence to prove ourselves right, rather than say, actually, they're probably a bit more D or a bit more S. So my recommendation to you is to look at it more like this. Actually, the behaviours that I'm seeing in this conflict situation are D behaviours. They might actually be a C personality type according to a proper analysis. So think about observing these things as behaviours in others. So you might say, oh, this person is needing more detail, I need to provide them with more detail. Or this person is actually looking at the big picture and the idea and so on. So I need to make it more sexy to appeal to their particular need at this moment. So think about like DISC when you don't actually have the proper data in front of you, or even your own. Think about it more as recognizing those behaviors and therefore needs of other personality types to help you to have different tools in your toolkit to be able to resolve these conflicts more assertively and also more effectively. However, the biggest question that everybody asks me is, okay, well, if I don't know their personality type and I don't even know mine, what can I do to resolve conflict more safely, to make sure that I'm not sort of accidentally doing too much of one quadrant or another? And assertive communication is the tool and the technique that I always say is really important no matter the personality style. So some of you might have seen my webinar last time, which was on these techniques of assertive communication, and I don't have as much time today to go into that depth, but know that we do a lot of work around that at IML, and I'm happy to share more of that, in subsequent sessions and so on. But the beauty of assertive communication, think of it as a set of rules, and you can see those dot points there. What that means is if you're following those rules, again, you're automatically working more towards that collaborate quadrant. Why? Because that's aligned with more of a win-win approach rather than I'm winning, you're losing, and that sort of transactional approach. So as a reminder for those of you who saw my previous session, and some of you have been in those subsequently where we've gone into a little bit more depth, but those assertive communication techniques, and I've popped just sort of the top 5 in there, are the use of active and passive voice. So if you're in a conflict situation and you communicate in such a way that makes someone feel blamed, they're going to be spending a hell of a lot of time trying to defend themselves. A barrier is going to go up, and now your time's going to be spent getting that barrier down rather than achieving the win-win outcome. So consider language techniques like active and passive voice, where instead of saying you missed the deadline, which is quite accusatory, what we do is use the passive voice and we flip that around, and instead we'd say the deadline was missed. So we remove the you. And the reason we do that is to eliminate that sense of blame and defense coming up. I'm going to jump to the 3rd dot point now. We might follow that up with a question. So we might use an open question. So instead of you missed the deadline, you've got to get it to me by such and such time. Instead, we might say the deadline was missed. How can you make sure I get it by 4 o'clock on Monday? Or the deadline is missed, what's happened? Or the deadline was missed, what are your ideas about how this process can be streamlined and improved? The deadline was missed, what are you going to do to stick to that every single week or whatever it might be? So passive voice plus question is an excellent technique when you're in a conflict situation. The higher the stakes, the higher the conflict, the hotter we are under the collar, the more important these techniques are, in addition to what I've just shared with you with DISC and personality. So open questions. Don't use statements disguised as questions. What I mean by that is sometimes we ask a question like this: do you understand? Subtext, you better understand. So open questions help you to move away from that, so they come across as more genuine. They genuinely look at getting agreement and proper ownership rather than just generating the expected response, which especially in line management, if you ask a closed question, e.g., do you understand? The answer is going to be yes. Doesn't mean that person understands. Even asking, do you agree? Of course the answer is going to be yes. Doesn't mean yes. You're much better to use an open question, say, what do you understand this to mean? Would this work for you? How effectively would this work for you? And so on. And that's going to give you a much better idea as to what that person really thinks and feels, and go a lot further along the continuum of getting agreement, ownership, and then follow through on whatever that conflict is that's being resolved. So active and passive voice, questioning skills. I'm going to jump back up to use of positive language. So that's where we are trying to maximize the effectiveness of our communication, largely through visualization. We say don't say don't. And the reason we say that is because the brain finds it quite difficult to visualize don't. When you're in a conflict situation, the use of positive language is critical. So instead of don't say don't, for example, don't slam the door, when I say don't slam the door, all I can visualize is the door slamming. If, however, I say close the door quietly, I can visualize that. So it's much better that our brains are working toward the visualization of what resolving the conflict looks like rather than what the problem is. So those techniques of positive language tend to go a long way to resolving conflict, particularly when you're in a really difficult situation, because it's saying to the person, here's what a resolution looks like, here's what good looks like. Closing the door quietly, that's what that looks like, rather than don't do this and don't do that, don't miss a deadline, get it to me by, is what we'd say instead. Never say never. This is one that comes up a lot in conflict situations. So what tends to happen is we actually use absolutes when we're cranking it up a notch, and it tends to inflame things in a conflict situation. I'm completely happy with everybody using absolutes when it's coupled with a positive. So you're always on time, you're always going the extra mile, you never miss a deadline. Happy with that. But when it's a negative situation, so you're never on time, you're always missing the deadline, those absolutes actually just inflame conflict scenarios. So remove those sorts of words from your language in a conflict situation and suspend judgment. So that's a really important point there. Suspending judgment is is about adjectives and describing words. Please remove negative describing words during a conflict. I'll give you an example, lazy. So lazy is a negative describing word. It's a judgment that you assign to something that you're observing. So when you're in a conflict situation, if you can avoid those words, you're keeping the barrier down. So what I recommend there is, instead of focusing on lazy and that terminology, instead you'd think, what's leading me to that judgment? Why do I think that person's lazy? So it could be they turned up late, or they didn't stay back, or whatever. Focus on that rather than the judgment you assign to it, particularly with negative judgment words. 4-part statements is when we really need to deal with something quite prickly. And I recommend you guys watching write down these 4 parts. When, that's our first part, we describe a situation. I, and that's for impact. So we might say, here's the situation, here's the impact of that situation. The third part of that statement is because, which is explaining the why behind the what. People tend to move in the direction you want to if they understand why. And lastly, solution. So that might be an open question that gains agreement and ownership. So it could be, what can be done about this? When can you get this to me by? How do you think this can be resolved? And so on. So when the deadline is missed, I'm concerned because there's still 3 hours of work to be done on it by Susie. When can this be provided to her, or how can we make sure she gets it on time, or whatever the follow-up question might be to resolve the conflict. So those 4-part statements tend to be really good. It's probably a bit too strong if it's not a conflict situation, but just addressing an issue. But the bigger the conflict, the more effective that 4-part statement can be. And then closing the loop. It's always very good to, in a conflict situation, make sure that you've got a follow-up discussion, because then you can go back and review. I see conflicts and the same stuff coming up again and again and again. What I recommend people to do is say, okay, well, let's go with that solution. Let's see how we go with that. And let's just try it for a couple of weeks. And if that's not working, we can try and come up with some other ways. That tends to make people feel much more comfortable. Think about that DISC. It works for the different personality types for different reasons. It works for a dominant person because they feel like a decision could be made and move forward, and if it doesn't work, there's not too much risk, and we can address it then. For the inspirational person, they see it as an idea test, which is great, and for a steady or a compliant person, they see that also as diminishing risk of making a decision, because they know that at some point, if that decision's not right, it can be reviewed. So a lot of people don't think about reviewing whatever the resolution of the conflict is as part of the process. And I think it's a really important part of the process to help to move towards that collaborate or that win-win model. So, I jumped forward. So I want you to think about those sorts of techniques in addition to understanding those personality styles. For those of you that haven't done DISC before, I would very much like you to look into that. It's one of the best things that most of my clients have said that they've done at all in their leadership journey. And that's something that can be offered through IML. I'll leave Sam to talk more about that. But I certainly recommend that understanding more about other people is the best thing you can do as a leader, but also when you're resolving conflict, which unfortunately as a leader you find yourself doing so very often. So think more about different instead of difficult. Everybody's motivated, they're here by something. Just might be something different to what you're motivated by. We're wired a little bit differently. Most people aren't trying to be evil, but they might actually pose issues and concerns because they are different to us or have different needs. So try and think about that. That's going to get you a much longer way into resolving conflict and therefore being able to be in that high performance quadrant. So I think I'm just about to run out of time, so I better leave it there. But I hope that that's been useful for you. I feel like I've been talking very quickly to get through all I wanted to today, but I certainly hope that that's been really worthwhile, practical, and giving you some tips and some ways to think about conflict and personality. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marnie. That was excellent. As always, very, very practical. My action list here is full of things to take away, and a fantastic presentation that I'm sure everyone on the webinar has taken away things that they can implement back into the workplace for themselves and for their teams. So thank you very much for that. And of course, DISC is a central part of our leadership programs at the Institute, particularly Foundations in Accelerate. Spends a lot of the first module built around DISC, so understanding yourself. Exactly how Marnie's talked about this morning. It's also part of some of our master classes as well. And we can also do one-off discs where we'll do the tool for you and debrief it with one of our facilitators one-on-one. So we can do that as part of the services the Institute provides. But let's get into the questions, Marnie, because there are a number of questions and we've got about 5 or 6 minutes. So we'll try and get through as many as we can. This is a great question that I saw came through. What if there is a situation where you need to influence a group of people? So, you know, things like a board of directors or, you know, an entire leadership team. So, you know, how do you deal with different personalities as a group?
And that is something that comes up for me as a chair of a board and having been a senior leader, but also as an educator. You know, I might be trying to influence all different types of personality types all sitting in the same room. And the answer is this: one size fits one. So you can't always influence everyone in the same way at the same time. So what you need to do is employ a number of those techniques. So you're giving everyone a little bit. So for instance, what you might do prior to a meeting is you might provide all that detail ahead of time. What's going to happen is the dominant person is probably not even going to look at it, but it's going to give the C and possibly the S that lead time to be able to digest the information before decisions have to be made. And what I tend to do is put things in different formats. So your D's and the I's, like short, sharp and shiny, visual, and it might be graphs and charts and so on, but there might need to be supplementary text. So if you think about providing information in a written form in multiple ways ahead of a meeting or an important decision or conflict being made, you're giving those what they want, and they'll take what they want from it, but everybody's got the information in the format and the way that they desire. And then you may actually need to have pre-meetings if it's a highly important decision to be made or conflict to be resolved. It actually serves you well to have meetings with individuals ahead of time. So, and that's perhaps something that takes time, but it can be really worthwhile to get everybody on the same page.
Yeah, thank you, Marnie. Very practical advice there. Can you train yourself or utilise tools to be aware of your default mode to be more balanced during conflict? So essentially avoiding falling on your sword all the time and allowing a potential win-win resolution.
I think if you've plonked yourself in one of those quadrants, you probably, it might have been a bit validating. You might go, oh yeah, I tend to do that. I do tend to let others have the win and so on. So you can actually, it's really worthwhile if you're thinking along those lines, it's really worthwhile to do a proper disc, because it will actually say you might be slightly S, for instance, but it might actually show that you have a secondary I or C, so that you can start to see how those things work together and bring in some of your other strengths. So it might not be the primary, more into your style, and that will help your own self-development. But the number one thing is focus less on how you are and more on what others need, and you will start to work towards that collaborate, which means you get a win too. But you're unlikely to get that if you just use the communication techniques that suit your individual style. You've actually got to use, so counterintuitively, if you're an S and you're negotiating or in a conflict situation with a D, if you give D more of what D wants, short, sharp, shiny, and use that language, you're actually more likely to get what you want, counterintuitively.
Excellent advice, Marnie. It's an interesting one. How does past trauma impact people's DISC profiles?
In fact, when we say people, when we do DISC profiles, and it depends on when that happens in a person's age and stage, but we say our DISC profile doesn't change terribly much over time. The exception is trauma. And that's true of anything in terms of the way, you know, trauma has an impact on our brain that has the same biological impact as a brain injury if we happen to have a car accident. So trauma will impact our DISC profile. It can have an impact on personality, but that's probably the only time that we would see major changes in DISC, you know, from sort of a young teen through to an adult. The only time we'd see major change. We'll see slight change, and we certainly see change in people's communication skills over time. But in terms of default personality, that's unlikely to change unless with trauma. Now, that's probably, in terms of dealing with that, that's probably another whole piece that I probably wouldn't go into in terms of, appropriate counselling and so on to better understand that. But this very tool is often used by psychologists to help people better understand their strengths and also the areas that they need to work on due to trauma.
Thanks, Marnie. Last question, because I'm sorry we haven't got to this. There's a lot of questions. There is a general trend of people, I think, dealing with difficult people who, I guess, they don't feel like they're getting a win-win situation. So this question is related to that. Not everyone knows, how to move forward with the collaboration model. How do you still get buy-in to resolve a conflict when you can't, someone just is not willing to resolve the conflict itself?
A couple of things. That's probably an hour-long answer, but two things that I can recommend: loads of questions, open questions. So if you're saying, well, would you be happy with this? The answer is no. Well, what about this? No. And you feel like you're to and froing. Instead, consider, how would you like to see this resolved? What do you think is the answer for this? What are your ideas about? And what it does is it actually gives the other party a sense of power. And sometimes conflicts just don't move forward because people feel that they're losing their power and their control. I say, I wish I had my whiteboard marker, I say, give it to them on a platter. Give them that sense of power, because when they have that feeling of power, that guard can go down. So ask them, what do you think? What are your ideas about? What would you like to see happen? And don't be afraid to let someone think about that and come back to it. Some personality types don't like being under pressure. So when we're asking them to decide something quickly, they can be backing into the back cave. So have a think about how you'd like to see this resolved, what you think the answers are. Let's get back together tomorrow and talk about some options. Get that guard down.
Yeah. Yes, great advice. Back to that assertive communication techniques that you went through, and I think it's really powerful. Look, Marnie, thank you so much for today. Once again, really applied learning, and I think people will take a huge amount back on their action plan lists and be able to try those different techniques and understand their own character or personality through the disc. So thank you so much, Marnie.
Right, I'm just opening up the questions now, and I can see so many of them that have come through. Apologies to those of you that we haven't been able to answer.
We will try and address those directly with those questioners, Marnie, if that's possible. Look, this afternoon, my colleague Perminder is taking over the hosting duties. Perminder's primed for coaching skills for leaders with Rupert Bryce. It'll be a fantastic session around coaching. I know there's huge interest in that from both members and our corporate members that are attending that session, and managing up, how to have difficult conversations with your boss. Once again, a very highly subscribed topic. That's with Grant Witherington later on this afternoon. So two great sessions to look forward to. Thank you so much, Marnie, once again. A lot of this content is done through our leadership programs, as I've talked about. We have an end of financial year offer on Foundations and Accelerate leadership programs. So please go online and see those. Any questions at all, please email us at info@managersandleaders.com.au. That's info@managersandleaders.com.au if you've got any questions. We also do corporate consulting work, so our facilitators like Marnie are very happy to work with your organisation on topics that we've talked about today, but also a range of other management and leadership development opportunities for your organisation. So once again, if you've got any questions at all, would like to inquire, it's info@managersandleaders.com.au. Look, thank you very much for attending this session, and the first one this morning with Mark Jones as well. Two very, very good sessions, and I'm really looking forward to this afternoon. We've got those two great sessions I mentioned earlier coming up. So thank you very much for attending. Thank you to Marnie for giving her time today. Fantastic learnings, and we look forward to seeing you at this afternoon sessions. Thank you.